Welcome to Clever English Podcast. Unlock your potential with Clever English.
Welcome to the debate. When we think about navigating a brand new city, there are really, two distinct ways to go about it.
Right.
You can sit down with a highly detailed map, memorize the grid system, understand the exact cardinal directions, and will mathematically calculate your precise route from point A to point B.
The cartographer's approach, basically.
Exactly. It's a massive cognitive effort up front, but you theoretically understand the whole city.
It gives you absolute structural certainty about where you are in space, even if you've, never walked down a particular street before.
Right, exactly. But then there's the local's approach. The local does not think about the geographical grid.
No, they just know the landmarks.
Yeah, they just know that you turn left at the blue coffee shop and walk until you see the big oak tree. I mean, it's not a mathematical calculation. It's a memorized, internalized pattern. It's a habit.
So true.
And today we are taking that exact tension and applying it to how adults actually achieve fluency in a new language. Is true fluency best achieved through deep structural understanding, or is it fundamentally a process of pattern-based habit replacement?
Yeah, and we are looking at a specific pedagogical framework today that makes a rather bold claim.
The Clever English podcast curriculum, right?
Exactly. The premise here is that unnatural sounding English rarely stems from massive, catastrophic grammatical errors. Instead, it comes from small, daily habit mistakes.
Little thing.
Right, little things. The argument is that native speakers simply do not actively think about grammar rules when they open their mouths. They rely almost entirely on patterns.
And I actually think this framework hits the nail on the head. I mean, if you look at how human language operates in the wild, it is about mimicking chunks of sound, not running mathematical equations in your head.
I suppose that's true for native speakers, sure.
Right. And my perspective is that focusing on the rote correction of daily expressions, taking a phrase like, I very like it, and turning it into I really like it, is the most pragmatic and effective path to natural speech.
Okay, but
When we treat language as a series of habits to be optimized, rather than, a textbook to be memorized, learners achieve automaticity much faster.
and while I appreciate the pragmatism of that, I see a serious danger in that philosophy. Treating language acquisition merely as surface-level habit replacement fundamentally limits a learner's generative capacity.
How so?
Well, mimicking phrases is certainly useful for short-term confidence, yes. But true fluency requires understanding the underlying structural logic.
I mean, does it always?
I'd argue yes. If you just memorize phrases without knowing why they work, correcting a mistake is nothing more than a memorized parlor trick. It does not provide the deep structural blueprints required to actually generate original thought.
Let's ground this in the experience of our listeners, though. If you are listening to this and you have ever learned a second language, you probably know that deeply frustrating, uncanny valley feeling.
Oh, absolutely. The uncanny valley of language acquisition.
Right. You have a massive vocabulary. You have studied the grammar rules for years. Your sentence is technically perfect. And yet, the native speaker looks at you slightly sideways.
Because the words are right, but it just feels off.
Exactly. It feels off. And this framework gives us a perfect example of why the math fails the distinction between saying, I go to home and I go home.
Yeah, that's a classic one.
Right? Now look at this through the lens of pure generative grammar. The learner who says, I go to home, is actually making a brilliant logical deduction.
They learn the rule for prepositions of direction.
Yes, you say, I go to school, I go to work, I go to the store. Verb of motion plus the preposition to plus the noun destination.
It is a perfectly consistent application of the rule.
It is. But English contains this bizarre spatial quirk. In this specific context, the word home functions not purely as a noun destination, but as an adverbial noun of direction.
It inherently contains the trajectory.
Exactly. Now, we could sit down and spend 20 minutes explaining the historical linguistics of adverbial nouns to a frustrated adult learner. But why would we?
Well,
The pragmatic approach here is simply to tell them to internalize it as a static pattern. You drop the to. You just say, I go home. It is an efficient, immediate upgrade that bypasses the heavy cognitive load of grammatical theory. You fix the habit, you sound native, and you move on with your day.
I hear that, but it creates a massive ceiling for the learner. You're treating grammar like a spatial quirk, which works for the word home, but completely falls apart when we look at the core architecture of the language.
What do you mean?
Let's look at another common error highlighted in this methodology, saying I'm very busy. The proposed solution is simply to correct the pattern to I'm very busy.
Which completely solves the immediate communicative problem. The listener understands, the friction is gone.
On the surface, for that one exact sentence, yes. But missing the to be verb is not just a small habit or a minor quirk. It is a fundamental structural failure to conjugate states of being.
That sounds a bit dramatic, doesn't it?
Not at all. Let's talk about how generative grammar actually works. It is a multiplier. The copula, the to be verb, is the structural load-bearing wall of that sentence.
Okay.
If a learner simply memorizes the chunk I'm very busy without understanding the grammatical necessity of the to be verb, they are trapped. They have learned one pattern which unlocks exactly one sentence, the present tense, first person.
But they can learn the others as patterns too.
But how do they generate she will be very busy? How do they construct they were very busy? By treating a systemic grammatical mechanism as a mere pattern to be swapped out, you rob the learner of the structural logic they need to independently generate 10,000 new sentences. One rule unlocks a universe of meaning. One pattern unlocks one door.
But that assumes that pattern replacement operates in a vacuum, right? Like, we're learning one chunk somehow prevents the brain from acquiring the underlying role.
Doesn't it?
No! Usage-based linguistics and modern cognitive science tells us that the human brain is an incredible statistical engine. You don't need to teach the multiplier explicitly because the brain induces it automatically.
How exactly? Because adult learners are notoriously bad at implicit learning compared to toddlers.
Well, think about how a statistical engine processes data. It looks for frequencies in recurring structures. By memorizing I'm very busy, she's very busy, and they're very busy as discrete, high-frequency patterns, the neural pathways start to map the overlaps.
You think they just passively absorb the copula?
They do. The brain eventually induces the underlying grammar naturally, without ever needing a textbook explanation of what a copula is. You aren't robbing them of the multiplier, you are feeding their brain the raw data it needs to build the multiplier subconsciously. And you are doing it without paralyzing them in the moment of speech.
But why force the adult brain to slowly induce a rule through trial and error over thousands of interactions when you could simply explain the structural logic in 5 minutes?
Because it doesn't always stick in real time.
You are asking the learner to wander through the dark, hoping they eventually sense the shape of the room, when you could just turn on the light. Adult learners have mature cognitive systems. Their greatest asset is their ability to understand abstract systems. Why deny them that?
Because explaining the structural logic often doesn't translate to real-time speech. I think we drastically underestimate the cognitive pressure of a live conversation.
Oh, it's definitely high pressure.
Right. When a learner is standing in front of a native speaker and there is a split-second pause waiting for their reply, they do not have the milliseconds required to access the grammatical formula, select the appropriate pronoun, conjugate the to be verb, and execute the sentence.
So you're saying the math takes too long?
Exactly. The math takes too long. They need a reflex. And reflexes are built through pattern repetition, not theory. Take the phrase, I very like it. The structural explanation is that adverbs of degree cannot modify verbs directly in this manner.
Which is true.
It's true, but it is incredibly abstract. If you are doing that math live, you will stutter. Teaching the pattern, I really like this, gives them an immediate functional reflex.
But your point about high-stakes conversational pressure ignores the times when structural errors don't just cause a stutter, they completely alter the semantic reality of the conversation.
Like when?
Well, if we rely purely on reflexes and patterns, we lose precision, and precision matters. Consider the classic confusion between I am boring and I am bored.
Oh, yeah. That is a very common error, usually stemming from how different languages handle emotions.
Yes, and a highly consequential one. Think about the visceral human stakes here. Imagine you are a young professional, right? You're sitting in a high-stakes job interview.
Okay, stressful situation?
Very stressful. The interviewer explains a complex project, and you want to express that you feel unengaged. If you say, "I am bored," you are expressing your internal emotional state. Not great for an interview, but accurate.
Right.
If you say, "I am boring," you have just told the interviewer that your personality is inherently tedious and you make other people feel apathetic.
Yeah, that's a rough mistake.
You have accidentally insulted yourself on a foundational level. This mistake completely changes the semantic meaning of the interaction. And this proves that deep grammar matters immensely.
But again, the pattern-based framework treats it as a habit to be replaced. You train the reflex. When talking about yourself, change the ing to an ed.
But it is not just a vocabulary swap. We have to explain the mechanism of participles here. Present participles, the ones ending in ing, describe the generator or the cause of a feeling. Think of it like a radiator emitting heat.
Okay, the radiator.
Yes. Past participles ending in ed describe the recipient of the feeling, the sponge absorbing the heat. If you treat this as just another isolated phrase to memorize, say, bored, not boring, the learner will correctly say, "I am bored," but tomorrow they will say, "I am confusing," when they mean, "I am confused."
I see your point.
Or "I am interesting," when they mean, "I am interested." Treating semantic divergence as a surface-level pattern obscures the critical structural mechanism. If they don't know the difference between the radiator and the sponge, they cannot communicate their reality accurately.
I completely agree that the distinction between generating a feeling and receiving a feeling is vital. But let's look at how our native languages physically wire our brains and why structural rules often fail to overcome that wiring.
Cross-linguistic interference.
Exactly. Think about the phrase, "open the light."
A classic example.
In Mandarin, in French, and in dozens of other languages, the verb used to describe opening a physical door is the exact same semantic concept used to describe initiating an electrical circuit.
Right.
The learner is taking a perfectly logical structural concept from their native tongue and applying it to English. The wiring is deep. Now, if we try to teach them the deep structural theory of English lexical collocations, meaning why certain English words pair with other words purely by historical accident rather than logic, we will paralyze them.
You think it's just historical accident?
Absolutely. There is no logical structural reason why we turn on a light instead of opening it. It is an arbitrary historical evolution of English.
I'll grant you that.
So, telling them to learn the underlying structure is useless here. The pragmatic approach says just tell them that open isn't used for electrical devices in English and hand them the pattern turn on the light. It is a brilliantly efficient fix for a problem that logic cannot solve.
I will concede that it is an efficient fix for that specific light switch in that specific room. But language is an infinitely generative system.
Right. Chomsky's insight.
Exactly. Noam Chomsky's foundational insight into linguistics is that humans have the capacity to create an infinite number of sentences they have never heard before. If you reduce language learning to a phrasebook of practical fixes for arbitrary collocations, you're fundamentally limiting the learner's horizon. You're teaching them to recite lines in a play rather than teaching them how to write their own script.
But nobody is suggesting we just hand them a phrasebook and walk away. This brings us to how this methodology bridges the gap between reciting basic phrases and achieving fluid, dynamic speech.
You mean the shadowing technique?
Yes. It's the concept of upgrading language through active mimicry, specifically shadowing.
The practice of listening to native audio and repeating it back out loud, matching the cadence and intonation.
Right. The idea is to move beyond what is strictly grammatically correct to what actually sounds natural in the real world. For example, taking a technically accurate, structurally sound sentence like, "I'm very tired," and upgrading the habit to, "I'm exhausted."
Okay.
Or upgrading, "I think it's good," to, "It's actually really good." The framework advocates for shadowing, repeating full phrases out loud at varying speeds, pausing and then personalizing them, saying out loud, "I really like this place. I usually come home after work," and so on.
And you view this physical repetition as the ultimate realization of fluency?
I view it as the bridge to fluency because of what it achieves neurologically and physiologically. Speaking a language is not just a mental exercise, it is a physical act.
Muscle memory.
Precisely. Your articulatory system, your tongue, your lips, your vocal cords needs muscle memory. When a learner shadows these upgraded patterns, they're physically bypassing the slow, clunky mental translation process. They're myelinating the neural pathways used for speech.
I see the mechanical benefit.
By adopting the established colloquial patterns of native speakers, their pacing becomes natural. They don't just transmit data, they sound confident, and they bridge the gap between merely being technically understood and genuinely belonging to the linguistic community.
I struggle deeply with the philosophy underlying these so-called upgrades, though. Let's examine this from a sociolinguistic perspective.
Okay, let's hear it.
Perfectly valid, grammatically sound, and universally understood English sentences. There is zero ambiguity in "I am very tired." So why are we telling learners that their perfectly functional English needs to be upgraded?
Because native speakers rarely use the stilted textbook versions of those thoughts. To sound natural is to reduce friction in the conversation. It makes the listener more receptive.
But natural to whom? You are pushing non-native speakers to adopt highly stylistically colloquial phrases like, "It's actually really good," in the name of sounding authentic.
Right.
These stylistic upgrades actually improves a learner's communicative clarity, or if it merely forces them to mask their linguistic background through rote mimicry. Are we telling them their English isn't good enough until they sound exactly like a 25-year-old native speaker from California?
Oh, it is absolutely not about masking their background or erasing their identity. It is about social pragmatics. Language is not just the transfer of data. It is a social bonding mechanism.
A bonding mechanism, sure.
When you use the cadence, the pacing, and the colloquial patterns of the community you are speaking with, you signal competence and ease. You put the other person at ease. The reality is that these small habit upgrades make you sound more fluent and more confident.
Perceived confidence, maybe?
And we cannot ignore the real world. That perceived confidence translates into better outcomes for the speaker, whether they are negotiating a salary, interviewing for a job, or just trying to make friends at a dinner party.
I do not deny the sociolinguistic realities of bias. People absolutely judge speakers based on colloquial fluency. But I argue that true, unshakable confidence comes from mastery of the system, not mimicry of the symptoms.
But mimicry builds the confidence to engage with the system.
Listen, shadowing a complex phrase like, "Today I'm a bit tired, but it's actually a good day," is excellent vocal exercise. It gets the tongue moving. But look at the internal mechanics of that sentence.
Okay.
If the learner doesn't understand how the word "but" functions as a concessive pivot, how it completely shifts the emotional weight of the sentence, or how the phrase "a bit" acts as a social shock absorber to soften a complaint, their confidence is a house of cards.
A shock absorber?
Yes. Native speakers use phrases like "a bit" or "kind of" to mitigate the harshness of a statement. If a learner just parrots "a bit tired" because they shadowed it, but they don't understand the mechanism of softening a statement, they cannot apply that mitigation to other scenarios.
I mean, they might.
The moment the conversation deviates from the script they have shadowed, the illusion shatters. The native speaker asks an unexpected follow-up question, and the learner will hesitate. They will falter because they don't have the structural blueprints to build a new response in real time. They only know the lines they memorized.
That assumes, again, that shadowing doesn't build structural intuition over time. The empirical evidence suggests that it absolutely does. By repeatedly shadowing complete, complex sentences, the structural rules are absorbed subconsciously.
Slowly.
But effectively. The brain extracts the grammar from the patterns. The learner who constantly practices "it's actually really good" will naturally start inserting "actually" into other contexts to soften or emphasize an opinion. They will use the shock absorber correctly without ever needing a lecture on adverbial placement. They learn the function through the feeling of the phrase rather than a theoretical rule.
Subconscious absorption is the luxury of childhood language acquisition. A child has 10 years and zero responsibilities to slowly absorb the feeling of an adverb. Adult learners, who are the target of this methodology, do not have that kind of time.
Which is why we use efficient patterns.
But they do have mature analytical brains. Yes, replacing "I very like it" with "I really like it" is a practical, necessary correction. But to elevate pattern replacement to the primary mechanism of fluency is a disservice. It denies the adult learner their greatest advantage, their ability to understand and manipulate abstract systems to create infinite meaning.
As we draw this discussion to a close, my perspective remains firmly anchored in the daily pragmatics of human communication. Language is first and foremost a tool for social connection.
Agreed.
What this framework so accurately identifies is that fixing minor, everyday phrase habits has a wildly disproportionate impact on how a speaker's proficiency is perceived by others. By adopting the established patterns of native speakers through active shadowing and habit replacement, learners can bypass the paralyzing cognitive load of doing structural math in the middle of a sentence.
It's definitely a shortcut.
It is the most direct, practical way to bridge the gap between being technically correct and sounding genuinely fluent in the real world.
And while I readily acknowledge that fixing those small habits is highly beneficial for presentation and immediate social smoothing, I maintain that true linguistic mastery cannot bypass foundational grammar. Treating language as a series of isolated phrases to memorize or prioritizing colloquial upgrades over structural comprehension leaves the learner fundamentally dependent on scripts.
Right.
Genuine fluency requires the ability to generate thoughts you have never had before in senses you have never heard before. And that requires knowing how the machine works, not just pushing the buttons.
Yet I think we both find clear convergence on one critical reality highlighted by this discussion. Small, daily linguistic choices dramatically dictate the success of an interaction.
Oh, without a doubt.
A learner's actual vocabulary size, whether they know 10,000 words or 2,000, often matters far less to a listener than the natural rhythm, accuracy, and appropriate usage of their most common daily expressions.
Indeed. The subtle mechanics of daily expression wield immense power over the communicative experience. Whether you understand the participle or just memorize the phrase, saying the right thing in the moment changes the entire trajectory of the conversation.
And exploring these multiple pedagogical perspectives, weighing the pragmatic efficiency of pattern repetition against the generative power of deep structural understanding, provides a much richer, holistic strategy for anyone engaging with a new language. You need the reflex to survive the conversation and the blueprint to build the future.
It proves that mastering a language requires an appreciation for both the surface-level customs and the deep structural currents beneath them.
Which brings us back to navigating that new city. You can certainly memorize the route from the blue coffee shop to the big oak tree to get where you need to go today. It gets the job done.
It does.
But the question remains, are you content just knowing the path you walk every day, or do you eventually want to understand the grid well enough to build a map of your own?
A question every language learner must ultimately answer for themselves based on their own goals.
Thank you for joining us on The Debate.